Hi, my name is Hannah Wallace, and I'm going to tell you about the Enlightened Absolutists. So, this time period lasted from 1740 to 1790, and the rulers during this time period believed that nobody under them should be able to question what they did or challenge the things they decided to do. The big topics that they dealt with were things like religious toleration and freedom of speech and the right to have private property. They also worked to help foster things like art, science, and education. And the rulers during this time period were Frederick the Great, Catherine the Great, and Joseph II. So Frederick the Great was the first ruler during the time period, so he was the first servant of the state, and he led the Prussian army in both the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. He wrote a book that was published not too long after he became king in 1740, and he had laws that censored the press, and he worked to have religious policies for things like toleration and segregation within the different religions, and he reformed the judicial system and made it to where even if you weren't born into the noble stock that you could become things like judges and things like that. And he died with no children. Catherine the Great was the second ruler during this time period, and she ruled from 1762 to 1796 in Russia. And she helped to modernize Russia and change the face of the country forever. She supported the Enlightenment and the ideas of the Enlightenment, and she was also a big supporter of the arts. And she played a lot of key roles in Europe, as she was the one that formed the first college for women there, and she had a massive expansion into the Ottoman lands. And a little bit of background about her is that she was known as Princess Sophie when she lived in Germany, but when she moved, she changed her name to fit in better with the Russian country, and she also didn't want that title following her from Germany into Russia because she wanted to help to adapt into their culture. So she changed her name to Catherine the Great. Joseph II, he was the third ruler during this time period, and he ruled from 1765 to 1790 in Austria. He was Austria's emperor, and he promoted religious toleration and tried to liberate serfs, but this policy was violently rejected by both the nobility and the peasants because it was how they made money, how the peasants made money, and how the nobility didn't have to do anything. And he was a very humorless ruler, and he was under a lot of constant pressure. And eventually he married Maria Josephia, but she died from smallpox after 2 years of their marriage, and they had a very unhappy marriage. And while she was sick, he never visited her or attended her funeral, and he later admitted to people that he regretted not visiting her while she was sick or attending her funeral. And he was never remarried after she died, so he had no sons. So his younger brother Leopold took over the throne when he died. So the wars of this era were the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. And the War of Austrian Succession lasted from 1740 to 1748 and happened while Maria Theresa was in power. And she went to the throne at the age of 23 after her father, Charles VI, had no sons. And she later had 16 kids, and her firstborn was Joseph II, who was the ruler of Austria, and she shared the power with Joseph II for many years. And then later in the war, England joined the war to prevent France from gaining the Netherlands, and France then took war to America to help divert. So in this war, it was like Prussia versus Austria and France versus England. One of the smaller rulers during the time period was Peter III of Russia, and he was a German Peter, so he hardly spoke Russian because he was born in a northern German state. He was very unpopular and unliked as a ruler, and his mom was Anna Perchona, and he was her only child. And later he married Catherine the Great, who could have possibly assassinated him, or he could have died as a result of a drunken brawl with his bodyguard after Catherine the Great tried to capture him. Nobody's really exactly sure what happened there. The diplomatic revolution took place in 1756 and had a peacetime alliance formed between Prussia and England, and Prussia was seen as an ally to protect Hanover from France, and Austria was determined to retake Silesia and then turn to France for an alliance. And then Russia later joined in the alliance with France and Austria, so they were all in the peacetime alliance together. The 7 Years' War lasted from 1756 to 1763, but this war was started in America in 1754, so technically it was a 9-year war. And this is the war that almost destroyed Prussia, and it caused Britain to attack France, which became known as the French and Indian War. And Frederick the Great feared encirclement during this war. This is when Peter II ascended to the throne. Russia switched sides, and then eventually they just dropped out of the war altogether because they couldn't keep up and they couldn't keep spending money on this war. And then the partition of Poland happened, and it made it to where Prussia really needed to avoid war in the late 1700s. And eventually in 1795, Poland just got completely removed from the map.
Hi, I'm Lauren Shell, and I'm here to talk to you about the Agricultural Revolution. This happened in Europe between the 17th and the 19th centuries. Mainly the farmers were peasants who farmed the land, and they basically just ate what they grew. They didn't sell very much of it, if any at all. They all had common land where they shared their farm animals, like horses and cows, because they were so expensive to keep. This is how they kind of managed to keep their farm animals and shared the expense of how much they cost. One of the important people of the Agricultural Revolution was Charles Turnip Townshend. He focused on making new farming techniques, and he also experimented with getting more animals to raise, and also with greater crop yields. He also came up with the idea of crop rotation, which really increased the way farming was looked at. Before the Agricultural Revolution, lords would own several pieces of land like this. They would chop the land up into individual strips and let peasants farm on each strip of land. Now, the land wasn't big enough for the peasant to actually make a profit off of what they grew, so they would just barely grow enough to make it their family be able to have enough food to survive. That's why most peasants were poor when they lived on the land like this. When the Agricultural Revolution came along, an open field system was made where they would let the land fallow out during a growing season. So on one field you would have barley, on another you would have wheat, on one you would have the common land, which is where they would share their cows and such things like that. And on the other field, they would let it fallow out. That's basically where they would let it sit for a growing season and help the nutrients get restored in the soil. Every year, they would rotate and move everything to a different field so that they could have different things on each field. So since this is the common land, it would just stay the same, but you would move the wheat down here, the barley over here, and let this field fallow out, and such and so forth. And that would be called the open field system. Now, Charles Turnip Townshend, he created crop rotation, which is a little bit different than the open field system. That is where, instead of letting the land fallow out like we did over here, you would actually let some fodder crops grow, and that's either your clover or your turnips, and that would give your ground the same effect as it would with the fallowing out, but these crops would allow the soil to get nutrients back in it without wasting a growing season. So you could still get something off the land even though it was still getting nutrients. So it was like a win-win situation. Also, the turnips and the clovers could be used to feed the cows and the expensive animals that lived on the common land. It would help them be able to feed them during the winter months, which was very expensive to do. Robert Bakewell also helped in the agricultural revolution by experimenting in the scientific breeding in cows, sheep, and horses. He also helped in irrigation and flooding efforts for farms, as well as fertilization efforts. He ended up doubling the average weight of a bull in 86 years, which is a great increase. And even more impressive efforts were in sheep. They now had a lot better wool that had a lot better quality. Now let's move on to the enclosure movement. This is where the wealthy landowners bought the peasants small strips of land because they wanted to make bigger farms. They fenced in the large areas for improvement reasons, and they forced the peasants to work in cities. They also sold the common land to be fenced in and made into a large farm. Around this time, there was a population explosion that was mainly caused by agricultural improvements. One of these would be the seed drill made by Jethro Tull. It planted neat rows of seeds that planted and covered them. This made farming a lot more effective, and it caused an abundance of inexpensive food. Now, the amount of food that was created helped with more babies that were surviving at birth, and it also helped with sanitation improvements. They had clean water, sewage that was away from the clean water, new canals and roads thanks to absolutist rulers, and the swamps have been drained, which meant less bugs. Now, another invention was the Rotherham plow. It was not the first iron plow that was ever made, but it was the first with commercial success. It was designed lighter and could be drawn by a pair of horses or oxen. Also, the introduction of American crops such as corn, squash, tomatoes, and potatoes all helped change the diets of a lot of the European people and helped change what they knew as food. Politically, Parliament set rules so that the nobility could easily take over the peasants' land in the enclosure movement. Socially, the nobility forced the peasant class off the land and moved them to cities to work and live. Economically, they turned from farming for subsistence, which is just enough to feed your family and not any to sell, to farming for profit, which is gaining money and helping the nobility or whoever is farming get rich. Thank you for tuning in and listening about the agricultural revolution with me. Now to the next segment.
This is Haley Sloop, and today we are going to talk about art in the Age of Enlightenment. The first period of art in the Age of Enlightenment was the Baroque art period. It lasted from about 16 to 1700. Baroque art was very naturalistic and realistic, and it captured dramatic movement rather than someone just standing around and chilling. And it was a lot of interrupted contours, like people didn't look perfect. The main focuses and characteristics of Baroque art are the use of lighting, because it gave it a very dramatic effect, and the use of diagonals, and the representation of tension within the work. Some famous Baroque artists were Caravaggio, Bernini, Rembrandt, and Rubens. Now let's take a look at some Baroque artwork. Now let's talk about neoclassical art. This period took place from 1765 to 1850. Neoclassical art was sparked by the need for more serious artwork during the scientific revolution and the Age of Enlightenment. Because of the Rococo art, it was very just delightful and not serious at all. They used art from before the Middle Ages as their inspiration for the art they were making then. Neoclassical art was more historically accurate than the art styles that came before it. Jean-Auguste Dominique and Jacques Louis David were two notable neoclassical artists. Jean-Auguste Dominique and Jacques Louis David were two famous neoclassical artists.